5700 BC, the sun set for the last time over Çatalhöyük. In the heart of Anatolia, one of history's greatest secrets lay hidden. Thousands of years ago, this fertile plain became humanity's first great home. This place, where water and earth met, gave life to tens of thousands. On the banks of the Karsamba River, the first steps of civilization were taken. Why did tens of thousands of people suddenly abandon that giant home they lived in for millennia? While thousands poured into streets in Mesopotamia, Europe was still in the deep silence of endless forests and solitary wooden houses. The grandeur of stone had not yet begun on the Nile. Life consisted only of the river's mud and reeds. In the Far East, life flowed with the rhythm of the earth and collective serenity, far from the greed of property. Across the ocean, the door had not yet been invented. Humanity was migrating boundlessly, without property, in nature's lap. What was it that the great crowd on the roofs of Çatalhöyük couldn't fit, that they turned their backs on one another? Was that first gap between the walls a sign of a breakup or a new freedom? What did that transition period that gave birth to today's cities take from us, and what did it give? The 1,000-year experiment ended. The great city fell silent. Now begins the great void and the 1,000-year march. The earth turned bitter, the fertile marshes dried up. Granaries emptied, hunger seeped through the walls. Hearths went cold, the 1,000-year fire no longer warmed. It was time to leave. Nature was casting them out. Smoke trapped in cramped houses turned the air into poison. An invisible enemy, plagues, seeped through the walls. The price of living side by side was heavy, bodies grew weak. Now these sacred houses were turning into graves. The necessity of living in tight spaces gave way to rage. The silent harmony of 10,000 people broke with a great roar. Neither rules nor shared meals were enough anymore. The dream of living together was replaced by the ambition for independence. The great community shattered. Families broke away from the city one by one. Safe walls were abandoned. The first steps into the uncertain step were taken. Those dark holes, where thousands of voices once rose, fell into silence. Humanity was escaping into freedom from this giant prison of its own making. Walls were no longer shared. Houses began to separate from each other. That narrow gap between the houses was the first street in history. Humanity began to breathe and see sunlight at ground level. Now everyone had their own boundaries. Privacy was quietly being born. Walls were pierced from below. For the first time, entrances moved from roof to ground. There were no longer ladders, but thresholds. The first hello was said at the door. There were no longer ladders, but thresholds. The first hello was said at the door. The door was not just an entrance, but the first shield protecting man's fortress. When the door closed, the noise and gazes of the outside world remained behind. For the first time, humanity tasted the peace of breathing without others watching. Now we had secrets, private moments shared. Behind walls were born. When the door closed, the community ended, and the individual and family began. The colorful stones in the earth's bosom were heralds of a new power. Fire brought the hard rock to its knees. Copper melted in the glowing embers. Molten metal took the shape of a new world in stone molds. Now, not only stone, but also metal bowed to the will of man. Çatalhöyük fell silent, but the dream it built was sealed beneath the earth. Though thousands of years passed, the desire to live together never died. Smoke rising from mud roofs has turned into towers, reaching for the sky today. We are the heirs today of the great story that began in those cramped rooms. The street was not just a road, it was the first boundary between yours and mine. Humanity took its first step from a common roof to a personal land here. The door and the threshold were born. Now the front of the house was as private as the inside. The giant mound of the past was giving way to an organized order, the first neighborhood. Streets were not just paths, they were the world's first free markets. Economy moved from the privacy of roofs to the transparency of the street. Barter came to life on doorsteps. The street was a bond connecting people. Every story shared made the city grow a little more. Loads were no longer carried on backs but on wheels that the streets now allowed. Ownership brought fear with it. Now it was necessary to protect not just the house, but the street as well. Those first stones surrounding the houses drew the insurmountable boundary between us and them. The door was now being locked not just for guests, but to keep the enemy out. Streets turned into the defense lines of civilization. Every corner became a new fortress. The street was no longer just a passage. It was a giant machine holding thousands of people together. As the city grew, streets began to carry not just people, but water and the burden of civilization. Where the street ended, walls began. The city was now both a sanctuary and a giant prison. In Uruk, streets were no longer just passages. They were the first great social contract holding thousands of strangers together. Doors closed, property became sacred. The street was now the sharp boundary between what belongs to all and what belongs to one. The sound of the wheel echoed for the first time on these unpaved roads. The street was no longer just for walking, but for hauling in trade. And then, time warped. Mud brick gave way to stone, and paths turned into imperial roads connecting continents. Light made the street livable at night. Random paths turned into a planned city. The gap between two houses was the street's first breath. Stone and gravel protected the street against mud. Crossing paths created the first public space. The cleanliness hidden under the street was civilization. The wheel widened the shoulders of the street. Climate changed. The Euphrates shifted. The street was condemned to the dust of a parched city. As the water receded, distant settlements were one by one plunged into silence. The streets became the dusty refuge for those fleeing to the city for survival. The street was no longer just a path. It was the last bastion of order. The wrath of the climate forced people to seek refuge behind massive walls. As the crowd grew, the rules of the street were carved into clay, not just memory. Records replacing words became the new and unshakable memory of the street. Information turned into an invisible power, governing the city and ending chaos. Water was trapped beneath the street. Hidden channels kept the city clean. Engineering turned chaos into health. Infrastructure became the foundation. The wheel made the street not just a path, but the main artery of civilization. Every brick was the work of a collective will that turned chaos into order. Randomness ended. The streets were now the work of a mind and a plan. The unseen revolution was under the street. The first channels gave life to the city. Speech faded. Clay tablets became the unshakable memory of the street. Millions of bricks protected the street from the chaos of the outside world. The street was no longer just a path, but the signature of a civilization. randomness ended. Every street was the work of a mind and a plan. The story of the street didn't start here, but here it became immortal.